To get his view now of what's going on in the USA, let's speak to political analyst Brooks Spector. Brooks, always great to chat to you. It seems like America has been sitting on a powder keg and it's now exploded. I mean, is that going too far?
Well, it's sitting on a collection of powder kegs, if you want to continue the metaphor a little bit. At one level, of course, there's been the COVID virus, which has produced 100,000 plus fatalities in the U.S. and 1.5 million or so cases, and no real end in sight. And on top of that, of course, has been the economic I don't want to call it a slowdown. It's virtually a collapse because of the lockdowns across the country. 40 million or so Americans have filed for unemployment compensation. That's roughly equivalent to UIF qualifications in South Africa. And that's an extraordinary number. And it's a number of people without jobs that really only tells you something reaching back as far as the Great Depression. And if that were not enough, then the more general cessation of economic activity only now beginning to wind back up in many states. Put on top of that, this event that has set off a whole series of other events. First the killing, then the protests, then the riots and looting, and then, of course, President Trump telling governors across the country that their task now is to come down really hard on protesters and demonstrators and looters and rioters. You get a feeling that the social fabric of the country is coming unraveled in significant ways. Part of this is that the president has been unable to or unwilling to or incapable of understanding the need for a president to reach out to everybody and try to bring them in a period of national pain and suffering, such as this layered set of problems really is. Instead, his response has been to call for a kind of crackdown. You get the terrible sort of shuddering memory for older people of, what shall we say, Mr. Botha 30-some years ago, of calling to crack down harder. And in the process of doing that, he's also picked a fight with the World Health Organization, and he's amped up his argument with China. I don't quite know how the president gets himself out of this. He's facing an election in 5 months and a few days, and he has to somehow come to grips with the fact that all of these problems together are not the kind of thing that makes you stronger.
Well, his reaction, like you say, some have said it's like he's going to war against his own people. He's not out there speaking to the demonstrators at all, sympathizing at all. He's saying to governors, be strong. How do you think that'll play out? Could there be more violence?
Well, undoubtedly, there's going to be some more violence simply because the rioting that's taking place in various cities has not gone through the full cycle of the kinds of things that happen. There are still lots of angry people, and they're not just angry about the man who died in Minneapolis. They're angry about, in many cases at least, a much deeper malaise that people understand with all of the police forces in the United States. There is no national police force, unlike might be true in South Africa. There are, I think the number, I've lost count, but I think the number is around 5,000 different police jurisdictions and therefore individual police forces. Some of them are well trained, some of them not so well trained. Some of them are skilled at dealing with communities. Clearly, some of them aren't. And even in a place like Minneapolis, which one thought had a well-trained police force, it always hinges on the individual cop on the beat to behave in the way that the training or the orders dictate, or to go on an individualized rampage, as Mr. Chavin seems to have done. And the fact that this, as you see on your screen, there have been protests, demonstrations, riots, and I think the number at this point was 26 major and medium-sized cities in the country. This doesn't burn itself out, bad use of words maybe. This doesn't end just by a finger snap. This takes a while as people finally get tired of it, as the National Guard begins to make its presence truly felt, and as people begin to feel maybe, just maybe, this isn't the way in which you exact a change in the society. If you were watching just a few minutes ago on various news channels, the family of the man who died was at a prayer meeting at the site where he died, calling for people not to riot, not to loot, not to burn, but to protest in a dignified kind of way in his memory. Whether that's going to satisfy everybody or convince everybody in the country, who knows? And some people, some police forces will find it is expedient to engage in more force rather than less, because they will have been egged on by a president who seems to enjoy, what shall we say, he seems to enjoy demonstrations of strength more than he does solving problems.
So you've spoken about the police officers, and I guess the demonstrators as well. It's hard to tell where public sympathies lie, and the difference in the various states. The demonstrations are playing out very differently. But overall, does this seem to you, Brooks, like a genuine uprising against what seems to be just a horrific, brutal murder? Or are there, as President Trump would like to believe, thugs instigating Antifa, etc.?
Well, I wouldn't call it an uprising. I would call it demonstrations of some serious rage. I mean, it's a huge country, and the fact that there are 26 or 30 outbreaks of this kind of thing does not mean the country is about to come unglued and fall to pieces. There are all kinds of rumors about who is egging on the violence, whether it is white supremacists, whether it is something called the Antifa, anti-fascist movement, which is not an organized group in the kind of way with members and a president, but seriously strong actors against police and against government activities. And there are people who want to argue that all of this violence may just be feeding the president's need to demonstrate that he too is a strong man in government, and he too can solve the country's problems, even if, as you know, one would have to note, he's helped create some of them. I think what really has to begin to happen is there has to be not just a conversation about the nature of police rage or police violence against citizens. There needs to be a conversation about the way police engage with citizens when they're in the process of arresting them, when they're in the process of charging them, so that we don't end up with these kinds of events that happen with dismaying frequency. Can I just pause for a second and make a comment? This is not unique to America. South Africa's had, in the last number of months under the national lockdown, what's the number, 12 or 14 people who died as a result of interactions with the police and military. So this is not a unique problem for the United States. It's one that police forces globally are not fully capable at this point, it appears, of dealing with easily.
Quickly, I actually wanted to ask you to comment on that. Mr. Causa in Alexandra Township, who allegedly was beaten to death. Some are drawing parallels. Maybe it wasn't white police officers, but we have a history of oppression playing out. Do you think those parallels are fair?
Well, they're different circumstances, true, but it's quite clear that police forces, paramilitary forces, military forces dealing with the difficulties under various kinds of lockdowns or shutdowns, they have not worked out the techniques for dealing with someone who is sitting on his step drinking or mouthing off to a policeman or whatever heinous crime they may have committed. That kind of crime doesn't require the response of being beaten to death, just as Mr. Floyd's crime, which was allegedly passing a counterfeit banknote. No one knows. I haven't seen the note, you haven't, and no one has produced it. That certainly didn't merit being choked to death. Somewhere along the way, people who manage police forces have got to get it out of their minds that their job is to subdue a population, and more that their job is, as the mottos of police forces often say, to serve and protect. Doing what's happened in both countries is clearly not serving and protecting. It's harming and in some cases killing. And the tactics that are used to subdue a recalcitrant arrestee, the tactics that are used to subdue someone who is resisting arrest, they've got to be more efficient, more sophisticated, and more effectively articulated conditions and techniques than we see now on our television screens in the U.S., in South Africa, and in various other countries as well.
All right, thank you very much for your analysis, Brooks Spector. And of course, we'll follow what happens in the USA today. Morning there, we crossed earlier to Washington, D.C. Those demonstrations starting peaceful right now outside the White House.